right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here for our webinar today on utility modeling, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the useful. Excited to be here with you all and to be joined by folks at RMI and Current Energy Group, our experts for today's webinar. My name is Kara Cooper. I coordinate Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, and I'm going to be hosting you today. If folks want to go ahead and drop in the chat your name, your organization, if you're affiliated with an organization, and anything you're interested in learning more about or that you want to share with the group, you're welcome to drop that in the chat and we'll go ahead and get started so we have plenty of time for folks. So, like I mentioned, I represent Kentuckians for Energy Democracy. We are a statewide coalition of organizations working at the intersection of energy affordability, utility accountability, and the transition to a clean, safe, reliable, and resilient energy system. We're bringing organizations together from across the state and across different issue areas to ensure that Kentuckians are shaping our energy future. And for folks who are familiar with Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, you know that we do a lot of work engaging the public around the Public Service Commission and utility cases in front of the Public Service Commission. And one big area of that work is understanding what utilities are proposing and understanding what goes into utility modeling is an important part of us knowing whether or not what they're proposing for our future is actually the best option. And so we're excited to have some experts with us today to help us better understand utility modeling and how that works. You want to go ahead to the next slide for me? If you're interested and you want to follow up with Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, you can email us at Kentuckians for Energy Democracy, the number 4 there at gmail.com, or visit our website to learn more, which is www.k4ed.org. Again, thanks for being here. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and we'll get started. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So we have Gabriela Tosado here, who is a senior associate at RMI on both the clean energy planning team and the state team. Gabriela's work focuses on modeling best practices in IRPs, integrated resource plans, economic dispatch of fossil units, and energy portfolio analysis. Gabby has analyzed and advised on integrated resource plans for interveners, utilities, and commission staff in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Kansas, Michigan, Montana, Virginia, and Washington. Prior to joining RMI 5 years ago, Gabby earned a dual title PhD in chemical engineering and molecular engineering and nanotechnology from the University of Washington, where she engineered printable I don't know how to say it, perovskite cellular cell materials. Thanks for being here, Gabby. And then our second speaker is going to be Maria Rompani. And Maria is a partner at Current Energy Group. She specializes in the economic and technical analysis of grid planning and operations issues, including capacity expansion, production cost, and energy storage dispatch modeling. Maria has submitted expert testimony and comments on integrated resource planning, plant economics, unit commitment practices, and power cost issues before the state utility regulators in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Kentucky, Michigan, North Carolina, Oregon, South Carolina, and Virginia. Prior to co-founding Current Energy Group, Maria was a technical director at Stratagen, focusing on grid planning and decarbonization issues. While in the past, she has also contributed to the development of large-scale energy planning models. Maria holds a PhD in management science and engineering from Stanford University and an MSc in electrical engineering from the National Technical University of Athens. Really appreciate you all being here. I want to give plenty of time for our speakers, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Gabby to get us started. I'm asking that folks try to hold your questions until the end so that we have plenty of time for the presentations, but definitely feel free to drop things in the chat as we go. Yeah, and go ahead and take it away, Gabby.
All right, hello y'all. I'm Gabby. All right, so for today we have 3 objectives during this first webinar. We're going to clarify the roles and features of these different utility planning models that are commonly used in integrated resource plans or IRPs. We're going to build an understanding of the key inputs and outputs of specifically capacity expansion models and the basics of how they work. And finally, we're going to equip y'all with modeling best practices to advise utilities and regulators during IRP proceeding. So let's dive into it. We're first going to zoom out a little bit. Planning specifically translates customer needs into vetted options for investments. So this is an opportunity for both utilities and commissioners, regulators to understand the energy needs of communities and businesses that the utility is serving. They're going to understand how this is going to change over time and identify the system needs to evaluate investment options. So this is where the grid modeling process comes into play. We're going to take these different assumptions and test the ability to meet performance and demand over time. And we're going to pull out least regret long-term investments and near-term investments for our future grid.
And I can add a little bit here, talking about the planning challenges that Kentucky and other states are facing. So when we're talking about energy modeling, the two primary objectives have always been affordability and reliability. So the models that Gabby will be talking about aim to find exactly this. They aim to find the least cost portfolio that is reliable. And of course, there are additional constraints and considerations. But if we were to look into the main mathematical blocks of a capacity expansion model, we would just find the objective of finding the least cost portfolio with the constraint of meeting the energy and capacity needs. So why is finding a reliable, affordable portfolio challenging today? There are a few reasons. First, we have some practical challenges. Demand is projected to grow at a rate we hadn't previously experienced. And Kentucky is experiencing some of that, although not at the same rate as like Georgia or Virginia, but still is experiencing some load growth. We have increased reliability needs because of extreme weather events and an aging fleet. And actually, Kentucky has that an aging thermal fleet, which, if we take all of these factors in combination, it means that there is a growing capacity need. To meet that need, we come across execution challenges, which could include interconnection issues or supply chain issues, or even like the current backlog that we're seeing in gas turbines. And to be realistic, other than that those issues, there is also an industry that's resisting to change, either because of like the current business models or simply because that's how it has been practicing so far. Second factor is uncertainty. We have a lot of uncertainty, which wasn't like that in some years ago. Uncertainty that characterizes load, the policy uncertainty, both at the state and federal level, and also market uncertainty. What technologies will be available? When will they be available? At what cost will they be available? In short, our planning needs some additional attention, as decisions made today will impact electricity supply and costs for decades to come. And we need to expand our planning and models to consider all the possible solutions and do the scenario planning that Gabby will be talking about.
All right, so why is grid modeling so important in IRPs? Grid modeling lets us explore the opportunities, risks, and trade-offs of planning decisions under different technology, policy, and economic assumptions about the future. So I've heard this phrase that grid planning is an exercise in imagination. And to dig into that a little bit, it's useful to understand what we do use grid modeling for and what we do not. We do use grid modeling to evaluate different futures using an internally consistent set of inputs and assumptions. By different futures, we can think about different technology costs, different policies, economic assumptions, helping us craft some version of a future world. What makes this especially useful is the internally consistent set of assumptions. The real world is very messy and really hard to think about how different decisions can affect things like investments or retirements or how the grid operates. Models let us make simplifications so that we could pass these different factors and better understand how they affect results. It's important to emphasize that we do not use grid modeling to predict the future. The real world is, again, very messy. Just because a model says the grid should operate a certain way in an optimal world does not mean it will. And it's up to utilities and developers and interveners to work to see the future grid that we actually want to come to reality. So what questions can we ask of our grid models? We can ask how an increase in fuel price would affect production costs. We can think about how different technologies that are just starting to come online might show up in a least cost resource mix, and how would it compare to a portfolio where those resources aren't available? How could new regulations, such as delaying coal retirements, change grid reliability? Of course, this is just a small set of questions that we might ask. Robust scenario analysis is a cornerstone of a strong IRP. Scenario analysis lets utilities show how different future conditions impact the electricity system. This is typically done through capacity expansion models, which we'll get into later, don't you worry. But this can also be done in production cost models. These can consider different pathways such as future weather, resource availability, costs, growing load, and other policies. And good modeling should pair the quantitative outputs from running scenarios with qualitative assessments. Who benefits from these different plans? What are the costs associated with them? And what are the likelihoods that these scenarios would actually happen? But I want to emphasize that more scenarios does not necessarily lead to a better plan. Good scenario analysis does include a large range of scenarios that explore realistic futures, but avoids unnecessary restrictions on investments, retirements, and operations. Really letting the models do their job to choose an optimal portfolio. Bad scenario analysis does look at a narrow range or introduces unnecessary restrictions, and we'll talk more about those later. So just to summarize, a robust set of scenarios is necessary for analysis, but isn't sufficient. We want to make sure we are avoiding unnecessary conditions. Finally, I want to talk about the uncertainty that goes into these models, because again, these are simplifications of the real world. The first is parametric uncertainty, which is how well what we put into the model reflects the real world. And we all know that data is messy. We're making assumptions. There's going to be data gaps, and it's not perfect. And that introduces uncertainty into what we are modeling. The second type of uncertainty is model or structural uncertainty. And that is how well does the model itself reflect real world dynamics. Now, when we take both model uncertainty and parametric uncertainty, these compound and lead to uncertainty in the outputs, which is why it's important to scrutinize a utility model. What are the inputs and assumptions? What is unique about the model? What simplifications are made about how the model represents the real world? Because those are going to impact outputs, and we want to make sure we understand what those uncertainties are and how they are driving results. Let's jump into what these models look like. IRPs use models with varying levels of time granularity and operational detail to answer different questions. I want to emphasize that it would be great if we had one model that does absolutely everything. But in reality, models run on computers, and that requires time and computational resources. Even some of the models on this screen that have specific function can take hours or even days to run. And because of that, we make simplifications in the way that models represent time and the level of detail that represents operations in the grid. We're going to be talking about four models: capacity expansion models, production cost models, resource adequacy models, and network stability models. And as we go through these four, they are going to have more detailed levels of how they represent operations and a more granular representation of time. So moving from multiple hours to a single hour to sub-hourly. Although we are going to be showing general statements about these models, they all fall on a spectrum and fall somewhere within these bubbles, balancing operational and time granularity. As we talk about this later, some technological advancements have actually been able to integrate even greater level of detail that have traditionally been less granular, especially for capacity expansion models, which is what we'll start with. So capacity expansion models have typically had the least operational detail and coarsest time granularity. And the reason for that is capacity expansion models are looking over the longest time horizon. They're looking at 10, 15, or even more years into the future to decide investment and retirement decisions. And their objective is to choose the optimal, typically least cost mix of generation, storage, energy efficiency, demand response, essentially to select resources to supply electricity for the grid planning area. These usually have a simplified representation of operations. For example, we may have some type of unit commitment, but we're making these assumptions to speed up the model. And this is a less realistic form of that than we will see in other models. The optimal solution is going to depend on the inputs and assumptions. What forecast are we giving the model about the future, weather years, fuel costs, and so on? And these models get a lot of scrutiny within IRPs because these are what the utility is using to choose investments and retirements.
And I can keep these short. So Kentucky's investor-owned utilities include Kentucky Power, LZ, KU, Duke Energy, and there are also a lot of cooperatives operating in the state, with East Kentucky Power Cooperative comprising 16 cooperatives, and finally, Big Rivers Electric Corporation. So each of those develops an integrated resource plan every few years. That plan largely relies on the use of an energy model. And these models include, we've listed them here. So they include Plexus, ProSim, and Compass or Aura. TVA, who's also operating in the state, uses Encompass, and the main concept behind its model remains the same: to find the least cost reliable portfolio. But its model differs in terms of like structure, user interface, and so on. And my understanding is that there is growing interest among stakeholders across the country to be able to replicate what the utility is doing and develop alternative portfolios as we're reviewing the IRPs. And I'm also going to note that there are some good open source tools that may mitigate some of the barriers in terms of like cost. But my main point is that no matter what the model is, their intention is the same. What's very important is to be looking at like how the utility uses them to develop their plan.
All right, so in some IRPs, the outputs of the capacity expansion model become the inputs to this next model, production cost models. This is already an example of a better modeling practice because not all IRPs pass inputs forward. But it is one good practice that we can keep our eyes out for. And as you can see, we are moving up the graph here in terms of operational detail and time granularity. Production cost models are going to have this finer level of detail and resolution for time. These models simulate detailed grid operations, matching supply and demand. They are usually running on an hourly or sub-hourly granularity, usually the course of 1 year. And they can produce pretty detailed figures of dispatch, like this one over here. They have a lot more detailed representation of unit operations, and will have unit commitments as integer variables, which requires more power. And that gives us a lot of really useful outputs. As the name suggests, we can get details about production, such as fixed and variable cost of generation and storage, revenue from market sales and purchases, locational marginal prices, detailed dispatch data, renewable curtailment, and fuel consumption and emissions. Outputs from the capacity expansion model are also inputs to the resource adequacy model. The reason why we group these two together is because these models are really similar under the have my slides gone away? No, the slides, oh dear. Give me 1 minute. There is some type of issue happening. Okay. We see screen sharing again?
Yes, and it did not go away for us. It was there the whole time.
Okay, it went
It
away
was,
from me,
yeah,
so
on
I
your
got a
end.
little frightened.
So
Okay,
we're good
perfect.
now.
Thank you so much. Um, really similar under these models are really similar under the hood. And in fact, they represent operations in a similar way. They're just used for different purposes. Resource adequacy models are used to assess the reliability of the system. So while the production cost models determine how the portfolio would operate, resource adequacy models really focus on how reliable the system is. And that's the objective, to test if a system's supply and demand side resources can provide power under a wide range of conditions, including extreme weather. Advanced resource adequacy models are stochastic or mostly random, and they will have dozens, hundreds, even thousands of random draws looking at different outage conditions, different weather, different loads. And by doing this, we can see whether the grid can perform, whether it can reliably meet supply and demand during each hour, and if not, how bad that outage can be. So here is an example of outputs from a random resource adequacy model where we're looking at outages under different weather conditions. Under most years, the grid is fine. We don't see any outages. But some years in these colored boxes, there are outages that we see in different severities. The highest one seems to be representing 10 hours of outages as the most severe, but we can see there's a range. And these are exactly the types of metrics these models can generate. They summarize the duration, magnitude, and frequency of outages. And here are some of the metrics: loss of load expectation, or LOLE, loss of load hours, LOLH, and expected unserved energy. There's lots of development on how to best characterize these resource adequacy statistics. Our final model is the network stability model. These are the most detailed models and often work in the order of seconds. These models help understand if the grid is physically capable of supporting the expected dispatch given the transmission and distribution, and often takes the detailed dispatch from the production cost model as an input. These ensure that the grid can operate under a range of conditions, using detailed modeling of distribution and transmission network down to individual buses, and can help us understand if there are line overloads, frequency violations in a given system, and identify changes we may need to make. So we had an overview of our 4 models, but now we will take a deep dive into the capacity expansion model. All right. We're looking under the hood here. The capacity expansion models is minimizing an objective function. In this case, this is a simplified example of total system costs, which represents the net present value of system costs. And as I mentioned before, the capacity expansion model is usually looking at a larger time horizon, like 15 years. And so we want to minimize costs over this whole time horizon, which means we're discounting future costs to be in today's dollars. Total system costs have a couple components like investment cost, fixed and variable O&M, and non-served energy costs. And I just want to explain what non-served energy costs is. So these models are optimization models that are trying to minimize the amount we are spending in order to operate the system under given constraints. Grid planners don't typically plan a system to be 100% reliable because that would be incredibly expensive. So usually there is some tolerance to actually allow the system to allow some outages under certain conditions. And we set that with the value of lost load, which is represented by $1 per megawatt hour or a penalty if the model does not meet load. Sometimes the model might say it would be too expensive to build more generation in order to meet load during this hour. So instead, it will pay this penalty, and that's what the non-served energy represents. Given this objective function of minimizing total system costs, the model is making decisions. The model can make decisions on how much capacity is built or retired. It'll make decisions in a simplified way because this model is on the left side of that operational detail and time granularity spectrum. So it's basing this on simplified generation and also deciding when it makes sense to pay the non-served energy costs. The capacity expansion model is choosing these decision variables such as new capacity, retiring capacity, generation, and non-served energy to minimize total system costs subject to constraints. And those constraints help us assure that the decisions the model's making are realistic and align with planning goals. One of the most fundamental constraints here is power balance constraint, which can be found throughout most of the model and ensures that the power demand equals supply. And in the case where there is a gap, the model is paying the non-served energy. We've categorized additional constraints into 3 buckets. Operational constraint deals with how the system is reflecting operations. So those might be hourly renewable availability, minimum and maximum power output for thermal resources, charge and different efficiencies for batteries, transmission line limits, and so on. We can also introduce policy constraints like limits on emissions or a renewable portfolio standard. Finally, we have planning constraints, and these might be maximum capacity additions of a certain type of resource, hard coding retirements, resource lifetimes after which that resource would retire, and reserve margins for reliability. We're going to be talking a little bit more later about hard coding retirements in the best practices section. But this is a specific area that I think is important to really scrutinize carefully, because this is an area where utilities can impose artificial constraints on planning that risk putting the thumb on the scale of outputs. And we'll talk about an example later. So we have these core components of capacity expansion models. We have the objective costs that we want to minimize, in this case, total system costs over 10 to 15 years. We have decision variables. What is the model actually choosing so that it can minimize these costs? And we have constraints. And it requires a lot of data to parameterize these. We need cost data. As we saw in the first slide, we're multiplying many of these decision variables by cost in order to parameterize that objective function. So capital costs for investments, O&M costs, fuel costs. We also need to parameterize those constraints. So we're going to introduce several operational parameters in the model, and those might be heat rates for thermal units, minimum power outputs, and many, many more. For the sake of this presentation, I'm not going to show how planning constraints and policy constraints are integrated, but we can imagine a similar input that the user would add for those. I do want to highlight the importance of time series data. We are matching supply and demand, so we provide demand, which usually looks like an hourly load shape. As we increase the number of variable renewables resources, we'll also provide an hourly profile for those as well. We put all of these into the model. It's going to minimize its objective. It's going to make decisions for its decision variables, and it's going to give us results. And commonly, those results look like investment and retirement decisions. So new capacity, retirements. There may be a simplified generation for dispatch decisions and any non-served energy. So let's move on to this final section, which is leading practices. We've given you an overview of 4 different models. We did a deep dive on capacity expansion models, and now we're going to talk about some of the leading practices for them. As I mentioned earlier, we want the model to reflect a future world. Most of these best practices are trying to minimize parametric uncertainty and reflect the real world as much as possible through capturing the benefits and operational behaviors of renewables, integrating energy efficiency and distributed energy resources options and how it impacts capacity needs, and reflecting the real world behavior of thermal units. I want to dig in on what we're seeing on that vertical axis about time representation and granularity. Preserving time chronology in capacity expansion models is really important for capturing the value of renewables and storage. Now, what do I mean by that? Time chronology is essentially capturing the fact that what is going on at 6 p.m. that day probably is impacted by what's going on at 5 p.m. that day and 4 p.m. We are able to capture relations in order over time. We can imagine for storage, this would be important. If my battery is discharged at 5 p.m., there's less energy available at 6 p.m. Similar for variable renewables, if it's sunny at 3 p.m., it's much more likely to also be sunny at 4 p.m. And these are important relationships we want the model to capture. Unfortunately, some capacity expansion model decisions do not represent time this way. Certain models have simplification of time, such as low duration curve matching or time slices, that ignore this chronology and risk undervaluing the contribution of storage and renewable resources. A better approach is to use representative periods where we choose certain days or weeks that are representative of certain times or months during the year instead of modeling an entire year over those sets of days or time slices. But the key part is we want those days to have a 24-hour chronology. But even this approach has limitations. Ideally, a capacity expansion model should capture the full year using hourly time granularity. A recent study showed that doing this created a lower cost portfolio compared to even that representative day approach. This figure is taken from a long duration energy storage provider where they ran a capacity expansion model using a representative day approach and one where the model could see all of the hours of the year. The representative day approach didn't choose any long duration storage because it couldn't capture the value it provides by considering several days and the relationship between days. While long duration storage might charge over several days or discharge over several days, and the representative day approach wasn't able to capture that. The 8760 approach, which is all hours of a year, chose long duration storage while the representative day approach didn't. And the full hourly year method had a lower cost portfolio. This isn't something that's just happening among academics. Utilities are starting to use this approach as well. Excel Colorado in their 2021 Electric Resource Plan, which is their version of an IRP, use hourly granularity in their capacity expansion modeling. Capacity expansion models are also able to select energy efficiency and distributed energy resources in a similar way to supply side resources. This is often an overlooked feature. Instead of treating these demand-side resources as an apples-to-apples way as supply-side resources, often models aren't allowed to select and optimize them. Instead, they're introduced as inputs, introducing modifications to load shape to reflect energy efficiency or distributed energy resources. However, modeling them as selectable resources allows the model to select the most economic and efficient amounts. In this example, Indiana Michigan Power Company's 2019 IRP included an energy efficiency potential study. They then introduced scenarios where the model was able to pick energy efficiency as a supply side resource, depending on both the realistic and maximum achievable amount of energy efficiency, rather than introducing them as a load modifier.
Great, and I can provide some information putting what Gabby talked about in terms of like energy efficiency and demand side resources in the context of Kentucky. So as already mentioned, demand side resources are not evaluated at the same playing field as supply side resources in most cases. Instead, they are predetermined through other analysis, not capacity expansion modeling, and then including in that model. This means that in the majority of cases, additional demand side resources, which could be cost effective, or in other words, more economic than supply side resources, they're not selected. And to be very precise with the language here, they're not modeled as selectable, so they're not selected. To give you a sense of the gap, this figure demonstrates the potential energy efficiency savings forfeited by the Kentucky utilities in their existing IRPs. So it shows the total planned energy efficiency and then the achievable potential, which is derived from the realistic potential identified in energy efficiency potential studies conducted on behalf of each utility. So these are their own data. And the results are projected out to 2050. The potential studies do not go that far. And of course, just to note that this is the lighter green is the realistic potential, which is both economic compared to supply side resources, as well as achievable from a practical standpoint. If we were to look only at the economics, the gap would be even larger, and this lighter green would be going even higher, which it brings me back to the point we made earlier that we need to be investigating all the resources within a capacity expansion model, and especially the ones that might not be subject to the same practical challenges as others, to make sure we achieve an optimal portfolio. Gabby, do you want to move to the next slide? So again, here, just for illustrative purposes, this comes from a recent testimony I drafted for a Kentucky proceeding, so some of you might recognize it. It compares the cost of implemented demand-side programs versus the cost they can avoid. So, for example, comparing the two, one can see a cost of nearly like $60 per kilowatt avoided in terms of demand savings in the table above, and $25 to $27 per megawatt hour avoided. So this is how much energy efficiency or demand side resources cost. Now, what do they avoid? They avoid electricity, energy costs, they avoid generation, transmission, distribution capacity costs that, as you can see, are multiple times what they really cost. So what this is indicating is that there are additional cost savings that the utilities could pursue if they had a larger demand side portfolio. And if they compared that really on a level playing field with supply side resources instead of this separate analysis.
All right, I teased this earlier, but we do want to talk about economic retirements. Some utilities will pre-select retirement schedules and hard code those into the capacity expansion model. And doing this turns off features that allows the model to economically retire units, which reduces transparency and prevents the model from identifying truly least cost portfolios. One culprit of this was Duke Carolina. In 2021, the North Carolina Public Utility Commission ordered Duke to leverage the full capability of capacity expansion models to select the optimum retirement dates. The final practice I want to talk about has to do with reliability and ensuring accurate accreditation and capacity expansion models. Accurate accreditation, such as ELCC or effective load carrying capability, should accurately value both renewable and thermal resources. They should capture the different reliability contributions of different technologies, diversity benefits such as pairing storage with solar, which together has a greater reliability than the individual technologies, and saturation effects, where a greater penetration of one resource reduces the marginal additions to reliability of the next. ELCC has historically only been applied to renewables, but leading practice has it being applied to thermal units as well to capture their unique reliability risk. Disruptions from extreme weather, derates due to extreme cold or heat, or extreme outages. PJM annually updates and publishes ELCCs for both renewables and thermal resource types for their utilities to use. So just to summarize these best practices, again, they center on trying to capture a future world. We want to preserve time chronology and integrate hourly granularity in capacity expansion models to best capture the benefits of renewables. We want to incorporate energy efficiency and distributed energy resources as selectable resources. And we want to allow the model to retire units economically and apply reliability metrics and accreditation to all technologies, including thermal units.
And before closing, let's also touch upon very briefly upon SB4 and 349, which impose additional constraints and consideration in resource planning for Kentucky. So the review again focuses on whether those restrictions interfere with the modeling process that Gabby described and the optimization process as explained in the presentation today, and whether they could potentially result in a suboptimal portfolio. So the previous slide included leading practices, best practices, which include modeling of demand side resources, appropriate capacity accreditation of all resources, and economic retirement of thermal units. In short, best practices dictate that we should be providing the model with all potential resources, with the appropriate inputs, let it optimize. Now, the language in those bills can pose risks both on reliability and affordability, the two main objectives, by interfering with the process, whether that is delaying the retirement of fossil fuel generators, limiting what resources could replace thermal generators, limiting the reliance on market resources and overall challenges in terms of like the planning for reliability and least cost. And these can result, instead of letting the model optimize, this just tries to do some of that exogenously and does not result in optimal portfolios. Instead, the portfolios could have increased costs, increased risks to reliability by forcing in, units that are increasingly becoming unreliable, and of course, increased emissions. And I'll pause here for Kara to take over.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for that so much. I'm just going to open it up for questions. Do folks have any questions for our presenters?
Hey, Kara, this is Randy. I have one.
Go for it.
Hey, you all. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I'm putting this in the chat too. But my question is related to data centers, and maybe you're going to be talking about this in a future one, future presentation. Looks like maybe on the second one when you talk about large load forecasting. But are any of these models able to accurately reflect what happens when many data centers or other large load customers kind of disconnect from the grid all at once, all at the same time, similar to what happened in Northern Virginia last summer? I think that was reported on in a couple of different publications where like 60 or so data centers just went off the grid and it kind of caused chaos. And is that something that's being reflected in modeling right now and that commissions and public utility commissions are worried about?
I'm happy to get us started, and maybe Gabby can add to that. But no, in terms of capacity expansion models, these are not able to do that. The load is mainly an input. However, as we progress, as Gabby showed, like with additional models, we add like time granularity, and we're looking at the operational impacts, not just like the planning decisions. And in the operational impacts, when we're talking, for example, for resource adequacy, we would have random thermal outages happening. And I think that our planning should evolve to look into like, what if load changes randomly? What are the impacts there? And this is the direction we should be going, but I don't think this is something that's currently in the models. Again, this would not be within the capacity expansion. The capacity expansion, probably the right question there would be, what load to include overall. And we don't even have the right response there. But then within the operating models, whether that's production, not production costs so much, but like the resource adequacy and subsequent, we could be looking into those impacts.
Yeah, I've definitely, as a additional lens for that question, we've been seeing a lot of utilities create. So IRPs usually for utilities come at some sort of frequency every 3 years, every 5 years, but because load is changing so drastically from data centers, they're either releasing IRP updates or some type of new scenario to account for a tremendous amount of load being put on the grid. And I have also seen some discussion about how to better reflect that in resource adequacy models and network stability models, but yeah, it's not that aspect of it usually isn't in the capacity expansion model.
No, so I thought it'd be maybe similar to like a thermal unit, a large thermal unit going offline, or several at the same time, maybe from a weather event or something. But I know data centers are such a unique kind of thing, and they're different they operate and they're different from a thermal unit going offline. And I think the study I read about the Northern Virginia thing was that all of them triggered going disconnected from the grid because of a change in frequency. And I don't, and if they're all going off at the same time, I feel like that's a little bit different than two or three large thermal units going off at the same time. And I think it'd be interesting just to know how that, the cause and effect of all that. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being a scenario in the resource adequacy model. Andy, I see your hand being raised.
Hi, thank you. Um, how, in places where utilities do not have to do IRPs, are utilities doing these kinds of modeling just for their own planning, or what models are utilities using just for their own internal planning?
So the question is, if a utility does not have to file an IRP, whether they're using models or not, right?
Yeah.
So um, you can see different cases. In some cases, they don't use any model, or they'll use a spreadsheet model. In other cases, they use those sophisticated tools, but they just don't have to file. And in some cases, even if they don't have to file an IRP, they might have to file a CPCN when they're requesting new generation to come online to be constructed. So it's a certificate for public convenience and necessity. And for that, in most cases, again, they have to present some analysis, which sometimes uses some of those tools. Now, the problem that we see in many of the CPCNs that we review is that instead of like modeling the whole system or the whole range of possibilities, they just do like a run with the proposed facility and one without. And then they say, hey, we need it. So it's not as comprehensive as the IRP. And yeah, sometimes we have to go and point out these gaps.
Thank you. I had another question. How commonly do utilities do network stability models, and have you seen Kentucky utilities using them?
Gabby, do you want to take this or should I start?
I feel like you have a better Kentucky lens
Okay.
than I do.
So those are not usually part of the IRP. They are part of the like energy modeling universe. So that's why we presented on those, but they're not like an IRP usually. It used to stop at the production cost step. Now the IRPs also do some resource adequacy given like extreme weather events and so on. If you were to look at an IRP like 5 years ago, it would probably just be capacity expansion, production cost. Right now it is capacity expansion, production cost, and in most cases also some resource adequacy, whether it's performed in every cycle or in every other cycle, something like that. So I assume that we will keep, as we progress, we will keep adding details. But right now, I haven't seen any RP in Kentucky or in other places that would have a network stability model.
I think the closest, there are a very handful of places that integrate more grid planning rather than integrated resource planning. Hawaii is one of them. So they integrate both transmission and distribution planning into their IRP. Their model can even decide when it's necessary to build new transmission, like that's a selectable resource. So that we've been seeing that a little more often, but it's still pretty rare, very leading practice.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Maybe I'll ask one while some other people formulate their thoughts. Gabby and Maria, thanks. I'm wondering how much you'll worry about the parametric uncertainty versus the model uncertainty and kind of like what the steps are of like identifying that in practice.
Yeah, I feel like I definitely worry more about the parametric uncertainty just because a lot, well, I feel like I may be generalizing. There's less transparency in utility planning than I personally would like. And so you don't have a good window into some of these assumptions and inputs to really assess what the parametric uncertainty is. While the structural uncertainty, a lot of these utilities are using similar models, so we know their weaknesses, we know what they're doing most of the time. We have a better lens into what's happening there.
And I will just very much agree with Gabby here that I feel that the tools that we're using are developing faster than the way utilities use those tools. And sometimes when they're developing and they become more complicated, some utilities might use that to add bells and whistles without like addressing some core items that need to be addressed.
I had another question. When energy efficiency and distributed resources are included as a resource in capacity expansion modeling, are they are you looking at very discrete specific resources and modeling the parameters of each one uniquely? Or are they sort of lumped like DSM is like just sort of a lump of a resource that is kind of has average qualities?
It depends. There
Um,
is some lumping that happens. But for example, for solar, sometimes utilities may have different types of solar. Maybe their planning area has some parts that have better solar exposure. No, that's not the right word. A stronger generation of solar than other ones. So they would input like level 4 solar versus like level 2 solar and see where the model and what it would select in those instances. But for energy efficiency, sometimes it's broken down by technology types. There's different ways that energy efficiency can be applied, and both of them have, or all di these different energy efficiencies have different accreditation contributions as well. They have different costs, so sometimes they're cut up in that type of way.
Thank you.
I think there's one question in the chat, Gabby and Maria.
yes, I think Cass is asking whether merchant generation developers use these same modeling tools. Um, Yes, in some way. Um, some of those modeling companies also provide like price forecasts. For example, using those tools, they say, within PJM, these are the prices that we're forecasting. And generation developers will mainly use those to figure out the economics of something they're considering. So yes, they're using those tools, but also they're using some of the outputs that come directly from some of the modeling companies.
Um, I'll do it. I'll jump in with a question. And by the way, I appreciate the logic has been very coherent in your presentation, and I appreciate that. It was very informative. Yeah, my question is, if you have a noticeable amount of rooftop solar, it's very distributed. It affects the transmission and distribution grids differently than a single solar farm, which is going to act a lot more like a fossil fire generation plant. Maybe not in hours of observation, but when it's running, it's a large single source. Uh, Tell us about the effect of the kind of um, rooftop solar widely distributed resource versus the solar farm single source resource.
Yes, that is why we enjoy it when the model can select the resource. If it definitely needs to be modeled as a separate resource because it has different behaviors and contributes differently, but it's still able to be chosen by the model because it does contribute to generation and contribute to peak hours, and that needs to be reflected in how we're going to see the model change or the grid change over time. What's also exciting is when you stack some distributed energy resources together in a virtual power plant, which a lot of utilities are starting to get into and model more thoroughly. So that's when you're going to pair together, say, some solar with some using electric vehicles as emergency storage with a little bit of demand response. And when you put all these things together, they act almost as an independent power plant that can be modeled, which is exciting.
All right, I want to recognize that we are at 02 in Eastern time. And so we're at the end of our webinar time. Thank you all so much for this. This is super helpful. I know that we'll be sharing the recording out with a lot of other folks who couldn't make it today. If folks have any other questions, feel free to send them along to me and I can pass them along. And if we could pull that last slide up really quick, this is the first webinar in a series of webinars. And so we will be hosting some more webinars co-hosted by RMI and other great experts from around the country. Stay tuned for those dates very, very soon. And appreciate everybody being here for your lunch hour.